Hallo? Harmon? Staat hij aan? Ja, hij staat aan. Welcome everyone. Good evening. Great to see such great numbers of people going out on your free, what is it, Tuesday night to this type of events. Always great to see. My name is Nina Dieters and I work as a curator for Studium Generale Groningen. Studium Generale is part of the university and the Hans Hogeschool. And yeah, what we do is organize lectures, science cafes, or interviews or discussions that are all focused on communicating science communication. And well, that's what we're doing here today. This is a joint effort with the Center for PPE. That means Philosophy, Politics, and Economics. And Lisa Herzog is actually the director of this group. It's an interdisciplinary group of researchers from these different disciplines. And I guess, well, I imagine that they just sit around at tables, maybe in a cafe or so, and tying all these knots of these different disciplines all together. And I think the topic of today is really very much a topic that applies to all these very different disciplines. Is my generation better off than yours, and does it matter? That's the general question for today. And for starters, I was kind of curious to see, I see a lot of young people, but anyway, I'm quite curious to see what generations are represented here in the room. Hands for millennials. Okay. Is everybody aware of which generation they are in? Who isn't? Okay, well, I have the numbers here, so please pay attention. If you are a millennial, you're born between 1981 and 1969. Generation Z is 1979 to 2012, and well, I assume there's nobody in younger than, what is it, 10? Any boomers here? That's 1946 to 1964. Okay. Well, I guess everybody's in. And well, the question here is my generation better off than yours? Who thinks that their generation is better off than their parents is? You are, sir? May I ask why, and how would you argue? No?
I'm boomer generation, so it's obvious that I'm better off than my parents.
Obvious. How come?
They grew up in economic crisis, Second World War, so it's an easy thing for me.
And a millennial that thinks I'm way better off than my parents? Or Gen Z? No? Okay, well. Of course, I invited people who know much more about this than I do. The build-up for today is that Axel Gosseris will do a short talk, Introduction in Intergenerational Thinking, like we did just now. And that will take around 20 minutes, and after that he will be interviewed by Lisa Herzog. Some words about Axel. Axel is a research professor at the University of Louvain, where he holds a chair in economics and social ethics. His work focuses on theories of justice and especially on issues of intergenerational and climate justice. And the interviewer, Lisa Herzog, who is based here in Groningen, is a professor of political philosophy, and she works on the intersection of political philosophy and economic thought. The interview part will take roughly 40 minutes, maybe up to an hour, and you are all very warmly welcomed to join in and share your thoughts, questions, but do wait for the microphone, otherwise the other people won't hear you, and also for the recording, it won't be recorded. So I welcome you to the stage, Axel, for now.
Thank you. Good evening. I wouldn't be able to answer the question whether my parents or my daughter has a better generation than mine. So I'm going to try to provide a few elements of introduction to the general question, which is my generation better than yours, so the previous or the next one? And does it matter? I'm more interested in the second question, does it matter? But I'm also going to try to give you a few elements on the first one. So there'll be four items. The first one, I'm going to say a few words about my generation, what it means. There are two basic meanings of generation that we constantly use, sometimes interchangeably, in public debate, one is called an age group, and the other one is called a birth cohort. And it's actually demographers work a lot on trying to find out whether something is an age effect or a life cycle effect, or whether something is a birth cohort effect. And it is very difficult to find out very often. So an age group is a group of people who share the same age, and in a certain sense, it's a kind of an eternal group, because if you look at your age, you find people in the 15th century who also shared your age, and there will be people, hopefully, in 2 or 3 centuries who will also share your age. So it's a group that is constant, if you want. And a birth cohort is a group of people who share certain, who were born during a certain period, and who will, from the end of this period, from the first day after the end of this period, the size of this cohort is going to start shrinking until the last member of this cohort dies. So these are ephemeral groups, if you want. I give you 2 or 3 examples of types of concerns of justice we may have regarding age groups and birth cohorts. If you take COVID, for example, typically you will ask yourself whether it's fair to provide access to intensive care units in priority to young people or to old people. And that's typically a concern of justice between age groups. But you might also want to know about whether the policies we implemented are going to have long-term effects on certain cohorts more than on others. And that's typically going to be a concern of justice between birth cohorts. If you take climate change, of course we care about the climate that people in 100 years are going to inherit it, and that's typically a concern of justice between birth cohorts. Are we doing the right thing towards them? But also, we know that certain age groups are more vulnerable to, for example, heat waves. Elderly people are more vulnerable to heat waves. So we can also look at climate justice from the perspective of justice between age groups and ask ourselves, what do we owe to other age groups, and are we meeting these requirements? Maybe a third example, pensions. So pensions involve a question of justice between age groups. How much do we owe retired people? But it also involves issues of justice between birth cohorts, because the issue of baby boom and baby bust is an issue of size of cohorts that follow one another. And so the question there is, what does a large cohort owe a small cohort, or what does a small cohort owe a large cohort? Right? So you can look at these issues from the 2 perspectives, and normatively speaking, as philosophers, we tend to give priority to justice between birth cohorts, because we believe that if you care about equality, the equality between 2 cohorts, 2 individuals taken over their whole life, their entire life, is the relevant thing to look at, and not whether at a certain point in time there is equality between these 2 people at an instant T. Right? So that's why we think that justice between birth cohorts is more important, normatively speaking, than justice between age groups. So that's the first thing I wanted to introduce you to. Then the second one is, does it matter? And there are different ways in which you can answer this question, but one of them consists in looking at what kind of general theory of justice do you tend to endorse. So I give you a few examples. For example, imagine you think that indirect reciprocity is your view about justice. So you think, for example, well, in order to find out what I owe the next generation, I look at what I received from the previous one, and as long as I reciprocate the same amount, I'm fine. So the idea of reciprocity, the intuition behind is that there shouldn't be any net transfers, so that if you benefit from 100, you should give back 100. Okay, that's the idea. So in that sense, if you are better off, in a sense, you benefited from more than what you gave back. You might say, in first approximation, it might potentially be a problem. Now, consider a second view, sufficiency. There you think what justice requires is not to make sure that people have the same opportunities, for example, but that each of us has enough. Right? For example, a basic needs view of justice. So if you are a basic needs person, if you think that's the key demand of justice, then you might say, does it really matter whether they are better off than us? Not necessarily. What matters is that we all have enough, right? As soon as we have enough, if that's the only demand of justice, whether some are better than the others is not a concern of justice, right? So in that case, you will not be too concerned about this question. Now consider a utilitarian. So utilitarians care about efficiency. They care about maximizing well-being or other things in society at large. And so they don't mind to sacrifice some people if the benefits for others are huge, right? Or at least significant. So imagine we have a lot of generations ahead, and take, for example, the climate. We might say it's worth it that we sacrifice ourselves because there are so many generations ahead, and or hopefully at least, and that they will get a lot of benefits from our efforts. So in that case, you might say, what do I have to say about whether a generation is better than us, right? You might say it's actually maybe a requirement of justice that we make sure that the next generations will be better than us. Because that would be a sign that we are maximizing the total amount of well-being across generations. Okay? So these are three examples that show that depending on the theory of justice that you will defend or endorse, the answer to this question will be relevant or less relevant. So for a sufficientarian, for example, maybe it's less relevant. You just care about whether people have a life that is good enough. Okay, so that was the second thing I wanted to tell you. The third thing is, let's go back to, is my generation better? So it's a matter for social scientists and also for natural scientists to help us find out about these things. And of course, there are also normative dimensions in the way we assess these things. So I wanted to share with you a few observations about that. So the first one is, some people offer us accounts of intergenerational justice that ask the question whether a society is pro-child or pro-elderly. So basically, what they do, they first look at financial transfers within social security, and then usually, if you take countries like Germany or Belgium and so on, usually the outcome is going to be that these transfers are pro-elderly, that we make more transfers to the elderly than to young people. Now, if you include in that calculation the family transfers and the time spent by parents and so on, then, and you aggregate that, you get a different picture, and the picture is that our societies tend to be slightly pro-child, right? Okay? So depending on what you look at and the way you aggregate it, you get a sense of whether your society is pro-child or pro-elderly. But remember this distinction between birth cohorts and age groups. This only tells us something about age groups. It doesn't necessarily tell us about anything about what's going on over people's entire lives, right? So we need then, when you look at these studies, we need to try and find out what they possibly mean for our assessments in terms of birth cohorts. Second example, you might be concerned about sustainability. And you might understand sustainability as, for example, the idea of a non-declining stock of a certain set of things that matter. Right? It can be energy, it can be biodiversity, it can be other things. So does that give us an indication about whether we are meeting the demands of justice between birth cohorts? Not necessarily, because you might have a non-declining stock, but this still doesn't tell you about which generations benefit from this stock, right? So you might have a situation in which your stock of resources is not declining over time, but that some generations benefit more from this stock than other generations for historical reasons. So sustainability as such is not sufficient to tell us whether we are meeting the demands of intergenerational justice. So what we need to do, we need to look at various dimensions of people's life, housing, education, healthcare, and so on. And we need to run longitudinal measurements of these things. So we need to segregate age effects from period effects, from cohort effects. And this is the kind of exercise that several people have done. So I brought here one example, which is a recent book by Bobby Duffy. But there are many other authors. I'm going to mention another one, Louis Chauvel. He did it for France, but you have some people who did it for the UK, for New Zealand. So people who ran this kind of exercise on full cohorts, comparing the different overlapping cohorts and trying to find out whether some are faring better than the other. So you mentioned the baby boom story, and of course the typical narrative for the baby boom people is that when they were kids, the conditions for kids were great, and then they entered the labor market, and labor markets at that time were fantastic. There was no unemployment, and then, of course, when they retired, the condition of the pension systems was perfect. And then the story is that the next generation got completely different conditions, with education being more expensive, or childcare being less well covered, and the labor market being more unfavorable, and then pension schemes being less guaranteed, right? So this is the typical story, and of course people like Duffy, they try to check whether these stories actually make sense, whether it's a story or whether it's reality. And so this is the kind of exercise. So then the fourth point is I wanted to give you a few examples. So maybe some from Duffy. So one thing he insists upon is one indicator he uses is the sense of loneliness that people feel. And he shows that the evolution of the housing market, but other dimensions as well, are such that people tend to live more and more isolated. But the interesting thing is that the feeling of loneliness is not evolving in the same way. So the data seem to show that people don't feel more lonely than before in the countries he studies, despite the fact that they live more and more isolated. And what this shows is that in this kind of comparison, you don't need to look only at the objective living conditions of people, but you also need to look at their aspirations. And of course, these aspirations will adapt to people's existence. And so that's one of the challenges of these kind of comparisons, is that you might say the biodiversity, for example, that my kids got is crap compared to the biodiversity that my grandparents experienced. But still, they may not feel worse in terms of their vision of nature and so on, just because they were born in a situation in which biodiversity was already much more scarce. And so the difficulty is that some views will be more concerned about the objective condition of people, and other views will take into consideration people's aspirations, people's preferences. And one of the challenges there is that you might say, well, in that case, it's quite easy. If we transfer a world to our children that is not good, we just make sure that they get used to this kind of crap world, and they'll be happy with it, and you will not be able to say that they are in worse condition than us, right? So there's this tension between how far you want to go objective and how far you want to take aspirations of people into account. So another example that Duffy discusses is education. So he shows, for example, in the case of the Netherlands, he shows the increase of higher education levels in the Netherlands over several cohorts. And there what he discusses the value of education. So you might have a situation in which the level of education increases over the different cohorts, but the value of education doesn't necessarily increase accordingly. So we have objective figures about the level of education, but it's a different story to analyze whether it makes people's life actually better. I give you a last example. So the general message of this book of Duffy, I give you this as an example, is that we overemphasize generational differences, and that, for example, the country in which you're born has a much larger impact than the generation in which you're born, right? I guess this is true for overlapping generations. If you compare with the generation of prehistoric Dutch people, I guess there is a big difference. But he's comparing the 5 generations we mentioned, which is pre-war generation, so before 45, baby boomers, 45, 65, X generation, 66, 79, my generation, millennials, 80, 95, and then Z generation, which is 96 onwards. Right? And when he compares these generations, he identifies some differences. For example, there are some interesting effects in terms of delaying effects regarding housing, with then subsequent effect on when people marry, when they have kids, and so on. So the housing market has an effect on demography and these things. But he says that these effects are not as major as we would expect. And so what he does is he's basically proposing graphs where you see the different cohorts and curves that evolve. Now, a different author, Chauvel, has been studying different countries as well, but mostly France. And there was an interesting, so they published a paper with a German guy called Schroeder in it was in 2014. And there was one interesting passage. I'm going to read it to you. It's in French, but I'm going to translate it. So he says the comparison for similar age, sex, level of education indicates that to be an immigrant in France entails a loss of income of about 15%. So if you compare immigrants and non-immigrants. And this is the magnitude of French discrimination towards immigrants. And then he says, this is less in intensity than the discrimination between generations. So the difference between the cohorts born in 70 and the cohorts born in 40. Right? So he says the magnitude of that difference is larger than the 15% of life income between immigrants and non-immigrants. So that gives you a different picture in the specific case of France that insists on the fact that, according to Chauvel and Schroeder, the differences are significant between generations if you take them over their entire lifetimes. So this probably shows you that, and I'm not a social scientist, I'm a philosopher, so I'm looking at this with the normative eye, that actually there are a lot of different views on how to compare generations. So Duffy has a more deflationary message. He says we exaggerate. And Chauvel says, no, we don't see it. We don't see it. We don't see it. Why we don't see it? Because actually we are constantly living together, but we know a lot about the past of those who are older, but we know very little about the future of those who are young. But we need, in order to make meaningful comparisons, we need to compare entire lives. So we need to compare all the past of currently old people and all the future of currently young people, and try to approximate what is likely to happen at the end. Right? So it's a very, that's why people like Chauvel say these things are invisible. That's why we need to keep insisting on them. And people like Duffy say we keep insisting on them, but we exaggerate the differences. Okay, so I'm not going to arbitrate these things now. I just wanted to indicate that there are very different ways of looking at this, even among people who do social science, who look at facts and so on. Social facts. Thank you.
Thank you, Axel. I now have the privilege of asking Axel a few first questions, but we want to also give you the floor later on. So please think about questions you might want to raise, and we'll then have the microphone and pass this around. But thank you for this introduction to all these different dimensions of the problem and also the difficulties of actually grasping the social reality of these different generations. When we were planning this event, I came across a song once more which deals with the expectations of different generations and the fear that things are going downhill. So the sense that the current generation is actually much worse off than previous generations, which today sometimes you see in newspapers. And this is actually an old song, Allentown by Billy Joel, which is about this post-industrial town in the US, and the song is from, someone knows? 82. So in 82, people already had the sense things are going downhill. Here's two lines from the lyrics. Every child had a pretty good shot to get at least as far as their old men got. And then it goes on like about how this is no longer the case. in the past, you could make as good a life as your father, no longer because industry is going downhill. So my first question for you is, isn't that actually a new thing, this expectation that we are always on the rise, that every generation has it better than the previous generations? In medieval times, for example, wouldn't people just hope that they could keep the standard of living stable between generations? And isn't it because of a general worldview of technological progress and better education, which may be very Western-centric also, maybe, that we have this expectation of every generation doing better at all? Is that maybe the historical exception and not the rule?
I have no idea. You would need to ask a historian. But I guess if I look at my own life, I would say I've never had the impression that, for example, in environmental terms, since I was young, I would expect things to improve. To the contrary. So independently of the idea of progress, I guess there are some objective facts about at least the environment, maybe not social policy, that suggest that. And also another thing that I have the impression that often we have this idea that we want a better future for our kids, and that's often the case, especially in poor families, because they live a really difficult life and they expect their kids to have a better life. And maybe this expectation of a better life comes from that, comes from the past where we thought, where people experienced really difficult conditions. And maybe we kept this idea, and I guess it has also been fed by ideologies, like even in communist countries, there was this idea of progress was very strong too. So I guess this idea of progress comes from different sources, I would say.
Okay, and it is actually not as widespread as we might think, you're saying, because it might come from the wish to climb, especially for families that are worse off. Do you think very rich people want their children to also do better?
I think they are not as concerned.
The family.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that rich people are as concerned as poor people to make sure their kids do better than they do.
Well, let me press you a little bit on this question of comparison. So you already mentioned that different social scientists measuring different things arrive at quite different pictures.
Yeah.
But isn't there an even deeper, almost kind of existential issue here? So again, in the Billy Joel song, he mentions that the generation of the fathers fought in the war. And then many of them actually died, and the others had survivor's guilt and had some trauma, whatever. And the young generation, even though they had a higher fear, a higher risk of unemployment, they did not have to go to war. So isn't there something deeply incomparable, also when you think about the different experiences of how much you can travel, what kind of media you use? Can we even make the comparison on this deep existential level of what it means to lead a certain kind of life?
I mean, as philosophers, we try to find out whether life is better than another. And I guess we use this kind of hypothetical or semi-hypothetical examples. And this gets multiplied because you look at the whole existence of people. And so, yes, I guess there's, for example, here in a book like this, but we usually start with the baby boomers, which are the post-war people, and the pre-war people are not really discussed. So we think it's a more difficult case to handle. So usually we compare baby boomers and we say, okay, these people benefited from everything, and from then on it went down, or at least the next generation had a worse situation. So yes, I believe it's a matter of comparability that. But I think that, and he shows it very well here, in this comparison, we need to take the expectations of people seriously. And for example, here he gives the very interesting example of the housing market. So the expectation of people to own a house. And he shows that actually in the UK, this expectation became quite strong because of very specific policies that were implemented and that allowed a lot of people to own their house. And then people started forming this expectation in these very special circumstances. And he says, but of course this expectation is unsustainable because these policies in place are not sustainable themselves. But then we get stuck with this expectation. And that's a key aspect of, I believe he discusses that in part 2. But philosophically, it's a key aspect, is that we can look at the objective conditions and we can look at the expectations. And do we think that, for example, we should work only objective conditions, or we should also educate people, for example, to be happy with less?
But
Because
then
if
there
we
could be the cynical version.
Of course, the cynical version of that is that we have this crap world, and we educate people to live with this crap world, and they'll be happy, and that's it, end of the story.
But then there are also these interesting questions of how we form these expectations. And just to give a sort of personal example, so my grandmother grew up during the war, and she experienced many hardships as a young girl, and experienced the scarcity of the post-war years and so on. And she later on in her life lived some things precariously through her grandchildren. So when I was traveling as a student and sort of discovering the world, she very much enjoyed me doing that and sort of getting the reports and getting the postcards from other countries. And she looked at it as, well, at least you can now do it. And of course, for me, there was also a sense of, okay, I'm looking back at her, and she did a lot for our family, and she had a much harder life. So how should we think about this relation, also when it comes to a personal level? The young ones can hear the stories about what had happened, but there is always the directedness of times, and the older ones can see what happens to the younger ones, but how do we deal with this?
Yeah, so it's a weird feature of the intergenerational world. It's, as you say, it's associated with the direction of time. So there's a whole set of asymmetries in this world that we don't come across if we compare countries. So you said it, you get inspiration from people in the past. You don't get too much inspiration from people in the future because you never come across them, right? And you also mentioned the fact that maybe the empathy works in one direction, it may not work very much in the opposite direction. You don't feel maybe too much empathy for people in the past because you don't see them alive in front of you, right? But there are also, yeah, it's part of a set of asymmetries, and for example, in the use of force, in our ability to force, to impose stuff on other generations. We can impose stuff on the future, but our ability to impose stuff on the past is much more limited. So I think it's part of the special features of this intergenerational relations that we have.
Well, I'll ask one last question, then I'll open it up. This is actually also a very interesting question. So we have different axes of comparison when we think about a just society, or maybe a just world, a just globe. One is generations, in the sense of birth cohorts, but then the other axis is socioeconomic inequality within cohorts. And you can then take the national or the international level. And how do we negotiate between these? And do we sometimes have to trade off generational justice against other forms of justice? Could there be constellations where, in order to make the world within a certain cohort more just, we might have to sacrifice justice towards future generations?
Yeah, that's a very important question, also politically, because we are running some studies in Portugal on the different political parties and how they would get the message of intergenerational justice. And for left-wing parties, they think it's a diversion because the real stuff is class struggle. And so it's interesting because it says something about the way in which people understand the concern for generations. And to me, when I'm concerned about our generations, I'm not concerned about generations as such, right? Like a generationalist or like a nationalist would be concerned about a nation as such. I think it's just a shortcut to be concerned about individuals and about the fact that there is some arbitrariness in being born at some point or at another point. So I think we need to have a very much integrated vision of intra and intergenerational. For example, when you have massive inequalities and inequalities increase across the generations, you think that's a reason to claim that the next generation is worse off because there are more inequalities. So I think these things are integrated. Now the interesting bit is that the reasons why you care about inequalities may be affected by whether you're looking at contemporaries or non-contemporaries. I'll give you an example. If you look at someone in the 16th century, there are massive inequalities between us and this person. So you might say, do we care about these inequalities? And Lisa would probably say, well, we care less about these inequalities than inequalities today or within a generation. And she might be right. And it's interesting to understand why exactly we don't care so much about these inequalities. So as philosophers, we are interested in whether in these kind of reasons. And for example, you might say, the reason why I care about inequalities is because when people have unequal income or unequal wealth, then that can have an impact on their power in a democracy and on their ability to influence the democratic process. And that's one of the reasons why inequalities should not be too large, right? But of course, if you compare inequalities between generations of the past and today, that has no impact on political power, right? So this is an example that shows that it's not only the magnitude of these inequalities that matters and that are being discussed by social scientists, it's also the moral significance of these inequalities that matters. So some people might say, well, actually these inequalities are large, but they are not as significant, morally speaking, as inequalities among contemporaries, because these inequalities among contemporaries matter for reason X, Y, and Z, right? So another example is, for example, some people say inequalities are problematic because we know from people's psychology that they care about what their neighbor has and it has an impact on how they feel, right? It's a phenomenon called relative wealth sensitivity. For example, if you're a biker in a society of bikers, you feel good, but maybe if you're a biker in a society of Ferrari drivers, maybe you feel not so good, right? But you have a bike in both cases, right? And so one of the reasons why people claim that they are concerned about inequalities has to do with its impact on well-being. Now, if you go back to the example, the fact that this person in the 16th century was much poorer than me, it doesn't have this kind of impact on my well-being.
Well, that makes us a little bit more stoical. Thinking back, they were so poor, so maybe feel a bit better.
It makes you feel good. So it's actually good to have inequalities,
kind
right?
Of meditation exercise.
Yeah, exactly.
I have much more stuff on my sheet here, but I want to open it up. Can I have a show of hands of who wants to ask a question? And ideally, we would have people from all the generations we have in the room
at once.
Question. Not at once, but one after the other. So I see hands over there. Nina is going to pass around, and then so let's try to keep track of things. And maybe you can just very briefly say who you are, and then ask your question to Axel.
Yes, thank you.
Or to Lisa.
No, he's the expert here.
Thank you for the lovely presentation so far. While talking about this, I kept going through my head of a presentation earlier given by the founder of Our World in Data. His name escapes me at the moment, but he looks at, I think, 6 or 7 factors that are important when you consider how happy we are all. And one of them is number of children born per family. There's a couple of others. And I was kind of wondering, those factors, we haven't really gone over those. How important are those according to the speaker in the book and according to you? How would they factor into this debate?
And can I add a follow-up?
Yeah, of
Are
course.
those factors constant over generations? Is it the same factors that make people of all generations happy?
Yeah, his claim is that over the past couple of decades, we have become a lot happier.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. You want to?
We'll take yours next, or maybe we can answer first and then we take yours. Is it directly connected? Then let's take it now. Okay.
It's also specifically on the the question of subjective experience and the individual's ability to adapt. And so objectively speaking, how do we measure happiness? And if people are actually adapting to the conditions that might or might not be better according to this data, but they're actually adapting and they're doing okay, then what does that matter? And does the subjective experience actually matter morally?
Thank you.
Yeah. So there's a factual question and a philosophical question. So I guess the factual question, when you look at Duffy, unsurprisingly, he says there are no major differences in happiness between the generations he studied. So that's the general message. He has a whole passage on that. Whether actually one possible explanation is these adaptive preferences, that you get used, you have a large family, then you see smaller families, you get used to smaller families, and you start to find this normal, you don't expect more, so you adjust your expectations. I guess that's one of the mechanisms through which we manage to keep this constant. And I guess another mechanism is that some stuff is getting better objectively. So you can also explain it that way, I imagine. Now, whether happiness matters to a theory of justice, that's a huge debate, of course. I would present it that way. I would say, if you're a liberal, you care about people's own view about what is valuable in life. So you have some trust. You trust people to some extent about what they value in life. So of course, you trust the degree to which they define themselves, their preferences, and then you care about the degree to which they can satisfy these preferences. So I guess if you are liberal and you trust people on these things, on their ability to form a certain view about what a good life is and so on, you will need to care about happiness in that sense of satisfying their preferences or meeting the demands of their conception of what they think is worth in life. And we will constantly, but in the case of generations, of course, the difficulty is that through education and other means, we can manipulate to some degree the preferences of people, of our kids and so on. And so if we are scared, if we see this as a problem, then we might want to go more objective and go more for what sufficientarians do. They say, we look at basic needs, we want at least these to be secured and so on. So maybe the world of generation is a little bit different in that case because of our higher ability to manipulate people's preferences. We also do it among contemporaries, because there is a lot of mimetism and we get inspired by each other. But I think in the case of education, it's stronger. But I would say, as a philosopher, you cannot really disregard completely the importance of people's happiness in the sense of meeting the demands of what they see as a good life.
But just to add one last note, there is also an interesting question about the social norms, about how happy you have to be and what you answer in such surveys and how that might have changed over time. So maybe there's a distorting effect there as well. Apologies, there were more questions there at the back. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry. Thank you very much for that presentation. I was thinking a bit about your comment about how we deal less or maybe care less with inequalities between us and the past. Because on the one hand, you think the past was the past, we can't reach back. But of course, sometimes we see attempts to do reach back, right? There are discussions for reparations for families of people that endured slavery. So there's at least a sense that some historic inequality should be set right. And also in work on families that live for several generations in poverty, you see more and more attention to so-called intergenerational trauma. So where, for example, a grandparent has a bad experiences with public services, that this lives on, this influences their behavior, that influences the behavior of parents, that influences the behavior of grandchildren who never had the traumatic experience itself, but still acts in a certain way towards institutions that can help to prolongate inequalities or inequalities of opportunity or access to things. From a justice or moral perspective, do you see, like, on the one hand, attempts such as reparations as an attempt to kind of justify historic wrongs, or is it because we care about the way historic wrongs live on in the present, right? That there's a residue of intergenerational inequality. And yeah, well, the same part, thinking about the other example of intergenerational trauma, right? Should we try to set that wrong because we care about the initial inequality, or should we try to set that wrong because we care about how that initial inequality lives on in the current generation?
Okay, thank you. That's a lot. I would say, if you look at colonization, when one of the things you're dealing with is intragenerational inequalities in the past, or not just inequalities, but misbehavior and problematic behavior within the past, right? So that is not equivalent to the example I gave where I compare, I look at inequalities between me and Jeanne d'Arc, for example, right? So I have no problem with that. This is an intergenerational inequality in the past, or intragenerational more than inequality, right? So I think there's nothing, and then your other example of traumas in the present inherited from the past, if there are traumas in the present, it can be, of course, handled as any problem in the present. So it's again a problem very different from this inequality between us and the past. Right? Now, whether I think we should, what I think about rectification, I have a bit of a strange view on that. I believe that I start from the assumption that I'm not morally responsible for what people have done in the past. I was not born, right? And so I think that if we want to respond to these things, we should, of course, make sure we acknowledge the fact and search the facts and so on. We should make sure that we assess these facts. If we think they are completely immoral, we should say it for sure. But then for the rest, I think that because we are not, I don't feel I'm morally responsible for what people have done when I was not there. I think we should go as distributive as possible. So just rely less on rectificatory justice and rely more on distributive justice. And this is the case for racial relations in the US or for so many other circumstances or interactions with former colonies and so on. I think we have a lot of arguments from distributive justice for transfers, even massive transfers, and that rectificatory justice is weakened by the fact that we are dealing with actions that took place before we were born. So that's what I would tend to say. But when you discuss, for example, I give you the example of historical emissions of CO2. I was at some point discussing with negotiators from African countries and discussing that view with them, but for them it was, they thought, no, but we want something rectificatory and so on. The problem is that we tend to have a bias towards rectificatory justice, but we often forget that what is behind rectification is a certain view about distributive justice. If I steal you something, the main reason why I owe you back this stuff is because you were the legitimate owner in the first place of this thing. And to find out whether you were the legitimate owner of this thing, you need a theory of distributive justice. So for me, rectificatory justice is parasitic on distributive justice. But people often have the view that it's much stronger. Like if you lost an eye because I broke it, my obligations are much stronger than if you lost an eye because a comet fell on it, right? But in fact, it's very hard to justify that. Of course, you might say rectificatory duties are easier to handle because I can go directly to you because you broke my eye, right? Whereas the comet, maybe we need to go to the whole of society to compensate you, right? But so I would handle, so the key message would be, if you have injustice in the past, of course we should find out about these injustices. Of course we should characterize them correctly and say clearly that it was wrong and so on. But in terms of reparations, I think we should go distributive rather than rectificatory. And sometimes you get much more transfer, I assume, than if you just do rectification.
There's one more hand here.
Yeah, hi, thank you so much. I was wondering about the progressive and decreasing life quality. So if I start off my life and I feel great, and then it starts to decrease and I'll die feeling very miserable, or the other way around, I start off miserable but I end on a very happy note. I was wondering maybe whether the book also says something about that and how it fits into some of the justice frameworks.
Yeah.
So we're at the age groups now.
Yes. So the question. So what we can certainly try to do is to evaluate two lives like this. You present two lives and you ask yourself which one is a better life, right? And some people will say, well, late finish is nicer than not late finish, right? And if you think so, it's an indication that you cannot just aggregate the different bits of your life, but that that the sequence in which they come matters to your assessment. Right? And a lot of people, so you also studies in psychology tend to look at that too. And there are some moral philosophers who work on that too, like Michael Sloat or other people. They say, okay, having a nice finish is very important. So if you think that, then that's evaluation. Then you think, okay, what follows normatively speaking? Should we make sure that everyone has a nice finish and that we organize society in such a way that everyone will have a nice finish? That's a possibility as well.
But could I
Yeah.
press you a bit on this? There's also a lot of research in public health and so on that shows that if people suffer as children, they often carry on the damages for the rest of their lives.
Yes.
And I mean, also the intergenerational ways in which traumas and scarcity of, I don't know, certain vitamins, even that kind of basic stuff are transmitted. So if you take, again, a more objective account, shouldn't we say, give everyone a good start?
Yeah.
That's what's mattered. That sort of gets them on a good track, and then maybe we just need to get rid of this expectation that over time everything gets better for us. Maybe that's what's wrong. Because objectively speaking, a good childhood is more important.
So in Duffy, he discusses this. There's a U curve of well-being. So the typical story is that the worst age is 47.2. That's the lowest level of well-being. Then it goes up again, right? And then he discusses that. I mean, this touches upon a lot of things. So one issue that is being now discussed quite a lot is inequalities between long-lived and short-lived people. So, and one of the issues is that the short-lived people, we cannot know in advance who is going to be short-lived. And so we cannot do, and if we wait until they die, it's going to be too late to compensate them. So the general message is that if we care about inequalities between short-lived and long-lived people, and if we think we should compensate somehow short-lived people, but if we accept the view that we don't know in advance who is going to have a short life, then what we need to do is to shift resources towards young people as much as possible, right? Now, this longevity issue is independent from the finish issue, because even short-lived people will have an end of life. We all will have, right? So the idea of having a nice finish is orthogonal compared to the idea of having a long life or a short life. So we need to combine all these things, and as philosophers, it's very difficult to handle, because if we take seriously people's views about what is a good life, you will have some people who say, I want to live a short, intense life. I don't care about my old age. If I have a poor condition and so on, I'm really willing to pay the price and so on. One of the issues in terms of social policy is whether we are willing to accept the consequences of this. Namely, for example, you might give an initial budget to these people and say, okay, you burn your budget, we don't give you anything anymore. Right? And some people will say, no, we need a mixed view. We need to, even for these people, guarantee some really minimum. But they might have a bad ending, right? But if their preference is, I want to do surf like crazy, I take a lot of risk and so on, and then be paraplegic for the rest of my life, that's it. So the question is, to what extent we want to take people serious in these kind of choices. And liberals will typically say, we value people's ability to think about what's good for themselves, and we value the fact that people form very different views about what is valuable in life. Some people think music is everything, and other people think, no, I want to devote myself completely to painting. And if we want to take this seriously, it has consequences on these kind of issues as well.
Thank you. There are lots of hands at the back there. Maybe we can take it from the back and then move forward again.
Good evening. I get always nervous when I speak publicly, so I'm sorry if I don't speak correctly. But when I think about generations, I always think about the German philosopher Karl Mannheim, who talked a lot about people or a cohort perceiving themselves as a generation. And I think he got inspired a little bit, or more than a little bit, by Marxist theories about class consciousness. And how much do you think that perceiving ourselves as being a part of generations or of a generation is helpful for creating or motivating people to fight for social justice? And in your also in your talk, I missed a lot about this. There was a lot about talk about justice, and it was very theoretical, but I mean, I don't perceive myself as a part of a generation. So, like you said, the second question of, is my generation better off than yours? The second question is, and does it matter? I think, for whom does it matter? I mean, your career is built on this, so that's fine, but for me, in some sense, it doesn't matter. And maybe now it does, because I had this talk, but that's my question, so.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I guess what you, if I don't misunderstand you, what you mean is that you're asking whether if I don't self-identify as member of a generation, if this is a dimension that doesn't matter to me, then should I care at all about justice between generations? It's a bit like if my gender doesn't matter to me, should I care about gender justice, right? And I guess I would say yes. So I would say if it's a dimension that has an impact on how your life will be, you don't need to identify as a specific generation member, or you don't even need to think it's important. You just need to accept the view that if your date of birth has a major impact or a significant impact on how your life is going to be, then you might have a good reason to look at intergenerational justice, even if you don't think that you don't identify, and if you think that socially people don't actually identify to their generations. But so I use a very poor notion of generation here, right? I don't presuppose that people need to identify. It's like, I don't presuppose that you need to be a nationalist in order for you to be interested in global justice, for example.
But there was something else in your question, if I may, and I think that that's actually interesting to pull out, which is that there can be motivating force in saying our generation is responsible for something. Maybe sometimes from Fridays for Futures people, I hear a sense of our generation has to fix this because we only have this time window. The next 5 to 10 years are going to be crucial. And this can be a very positive motivating force for politics. You could also think about historical examples where generational identity was terribly abused for ideological politics, sending people into wars and so on. So to what extent do you think in today's world the sense of being of a certain generation is still a political force?
So are you asking, Lisa, whether actually it would be good if people identified sometimes more with their generation?
First, it was the descriptive question. Do you think that is still something that does actually happen?
That
and
people
then
identify?
the normative question would be the follow-up question, is that a good thing?
So the title here, the generation myth, he got fed up with all these people blaming young people of a certain generation. So of course, it's not that these people maybe identify as a generation, but they identify this generation as one that is to be blamed because they are lazy, they are this and that. But I guess implicitly they also identify as not being part of this generation, right? But no, if you look at climate, for example, maybe this generational discourse has some importance. Maybe some young people say, you are screwing our planet and so on, so we identify as the victim generation or something like that. But yeah, whether it's necessary motivationally, you're saying, right?
Well, there's first a descriptive question. Do we see generational motivations in today's politics? And I don't know any data about this, but from what I hear in discussions with my students is that there is a new sense of we are the generation that needs to really push for changes on climate politics. And in that case, I would say there is something normatively valuable in this, even though there might also be risks, namely that you try to play the generations against each other in that kind of rhetoric.
If you look at, for example, climate litigation, you have also the Swiss case with grandmothers who sued the state and so on. So I think you have different generations involved. Typically, these cases involve very young and very old people together and so on. So I'm not sure. A situation in which you have a generation, but more an age group than a cohort is pensioners' party, like 50 plus, the Dutch party, but there were other pensioners' parties and so on. There they identify, but it's more as an age group, I believe, than as a birth cohort. Whether it's useful that they exist, I'm not sure, but...
That's another question. Let's move one forward.
Yeah, thank you. This is a very open-ended question. And when you laid out the options, maybe of reciprocity, sufficientarianism, utilitarianism, maybe that comes a little bit from the last perspective to some extent. So many of the comparisons are on generations that are relatively close to each other, right? The boomers versus the ones after, and then the millennials and so on. And the difference is, I think that probably moves up, but they're quite small. But I guess one could say, if you really care about these differences, shouldn't you take like a long history perspective, right? And so Lisa mentioned that in the past people didn't expect it to get better, because objectively didn't, right? So economic history is one where you have like stagnation for hundreds of years, and then you have industrializations, and things get like change very, very quickly, and mostly get better, right? So child mortality goes down, life expectancy goes from 30 to now, well, like 75, 80. And then you might think, okay, aren't those really the interesting inequalities? Because they're so huge, right? And then you might think, okay, looking forward, we might think about these tiny differences about the next one. But maybe, what's really at stake is the next, 500, 600, 1,000 years where the difference could again be just as big, Maybe we have enough power to make it really terrible for people in the medium and long-term future, or we can make it like, maybe there'll again be these huge differences, right? So the question, I guess, after this little spiel is, like, how important are these tiny comparisons between the millennials versus the Gen Z and so on, right? If, the long-term differences are so huge.
Yeah, so it's again this trade-off between the magnitude and the moral importance of these inequalities. So I guess here the assumption is that inequalities among overlapping generations matter morally, maybe more or for different reasons than differences between us and the past and us and the future. I believe that it's a very different story, inequalities with the past and inequality with the remote future can also be analyzed differently. Imagine that their magnitude were the same, right? I would say I would care much more about inequalities with the future than inequalities with the past. Because the past, the only way in which we can fix these inequalities is if the past people were worse off, is to make ourselves poor, right? So there's no benefit to that. But now, if you look at inequalities with the future or inefficiencies towards the future, there is still a huge difference we can make. So I guess to answer your question, inequalities with a more remote future, we have something that can potentially be very significant, and something that is also morally very significant. So the magnitude is potentially there, and the moral importance is potentially there too. Right?
But then some people worry that, and this would be an objection here, which you're probably very familiar with, that if you look so much to the distant future and say, oh, there might be these generations that will be so much better off, aren't we forgetting what's happening here and now? And shouldn't our moral focus be more on what we are doing here? So how do we find the right balance between a potentially fantastic future, but also all the things that we need to take care of within current generations or within closely connected generations?
So if you care about inequalities with the future, it doesn't follow that you want to make sure that the future is better off. So you will still be concerned about what's my objective. Imagine, for example, you care about a scenario in which the least well-off are as well-off as possible, right? The least well-off don't need to be in the future. They could be the least well-off from the present, right? And if that's the assumption, that the least well-off actually are likely to be in the present, not in the future, then of course it gives you a scenario in which you will think twice about investing for the future, right? So there is also some injustice in trying to make sure the future gets better than us, because there is an opportunity cost to that, and the opportunity cost is the opportunity cost that falls on the least well-off within our generation. So some people who are committed to the idea of maximin, for example, so the idea of maximizing the situation of the least well-off, they say it's unfair to transfer less to the future, but it's also unfair to transfer more to the future than what we inherited. And why is it unfair? Because if we have a surplus, we should give it to the least well-off within our generation, and if each generation does that, then we will have an intergenerational path that fits with the requirement of maximin. So, and of course, this shows that in that case, we don't care about inequalities as such. We care about maximizing the situation of the least well-off, which is still a different account of what justice requires.
So, fourth one.
Yeah.
Sure, we could list more.
It was on my list, but I hadn't mentioned it.
Yeah. There's a question at the very back here.
Hi, yes, thank you. I was wondering, because I feel like the question is very much related to it, as if like all these external factors influence the success or the quality of a generation. However, I keep thinking that, do you have any views on whether the political leaders from like a previous generation have an impact on the success or quality of younger generations? Because I feel like, especially, for example, in the US, in the political system, where the leaders are, or the political leaders are from a much older generation, but they have such large impacts in the whole country, whether they play an important role in the success of younger generations. Because I feel like that's not really discussed right now.
Your question is, do they have an impact, or is it fair that they are old and they have so much to say about young people? Or?
No, just your views on whether they have a big impact, and like whether a older generation can kind of determine or at least impact the quality of life for a younger generation, instead of all these other factors that may also influence it.
So you're asking about the specific role of leaders as opposed to other forces?
Yeah, I guess from an older generation, since they have they have a lot of power, relatively speaking.
So
Biden is, how old is he? Late
78 or 79 or something.
So as opposed to the electorate at large, or you think? So for example, in the case of pensions, pension reform, the typical discussion is, we want to reform pensions, but we have a majority of old people, they vote in a certain way, we are stuck. But that's not your question, no? Your question
I think, to give like a general example, if a political leader or a regime determines something on sustainability, or the course that a country is taking on sustainability, that will have a large impact on the people that will still be on the planet for a long time. So I feel like that's not really been discussed so far, like how large is that impact, or what are your views on that?
Yeah, I'm not a politician. Yeah, I mean, I can say, if you look at the impact of Russian decision makers, or of Trump or Biden and so on, I think it has an impact, a significant one. Now, there are other factors also, other dimensions that have an impact. I don't know what I could say. I mean, it's very vague what I'm saying. I cannot say anything more precise, I would say, no?
Maybe if I can try to sort of translate between the two of you. So you talked a lot about general societal factors that influence how successful or happy one generation is. And if I understood your question correctly, you're asking, to what extent are all these factors influenceable by previous cohorts, or sort of looking forward, how many decisions can we take now, and can political leaders take now, that will actually have an impact on these factors for future generations? Is that a fair reconstruction?
Yeah, that's kind of what I meant, yeah.
Well, I believe there is some room for politics, of course, and we should do it. Be it about climate change or other policies, we should definitely do these things. So there is room for political decision making. Now, of course, the evolution of technology and so on also has its own impact and makes things possible and other things more difficult. Like social media exists, we could politically decide to close them down. We don't. It has a major impact on democracy. So it's a technology that some people introduced and that we use. And so there is an interaction between all these factors, I would say, but I would definitely say that politics, there is a lot of room for political change through politics. Yeah.
And do you think there should be something like, what some people have proposed, a representative of the future in politics, in order to counterweight the age of many current, well, depends on the country, of course, but in many countries you have pretty old political decision makers, and the suspicion is they do not look far enough into the future, and maybe the electorate also doesn't, because old people vote for them. So should there be some kind of institutional mechanism, like a voice for future generations in democratic politics?
Okay, that's a huge question. So we did a book with a colleague on that. I was not very convinced in the end that we had a lot of room for institutional design. there are many factors here. So one factor that is interesting to stress is that social science or psychological studies show that actually it's not true that young people tend to be more long-termist than old people. Okay. And the determinants of long-termism, there are various determinants, but among some of them, there is of course poverty, but there's also uncertainty. And a lot of young people experience a much more uncertain life than old people. And as a result, they tend to be more short-termist than old people. So of course, we start with the intuition that young people have more life ahead, so they will care more about the future, but it's not as simple as that. So then if you want to use age as an indicator of the degree to which people care about the future, and some other people have, for example, used membership in an environmental association as an indicator of the degree to which they care about the future. Of other people have proposed that people who have kids not necessarily will care more about the future. But all these indicators don't really work very well, and we are not, they are not confirmed by empirical studies. So we, using specific groups and using them to care about the future is not so easy to do. Now, the idea of representation is also problematic, because we are in a situation in which we are going to say, I'm the representative of a group that will never be able to contradict me. It's a bit like,
power as the voice of that generation.
Yeah, let's say I'm the representative of women, but I'm in a situation in which no women can talk to me, and I can never interact with women. I would say, yeah, but nevertheless, I'm representing women, you know? And we see from the experience in real countries like Hungary, Israel, and so on, where they've put in place ombudsman for future generations, and it has had very little impact, and these people have done things sometimes. For example, the Israeli ombudsman, he was very concerned about cloning. That was one of the major issues he was concerned about. But this is not necessarily the main issue you're concerned about when you're concerned about the future, right? So, because this guy, it was not a committee, it was an individual. So it depends very much on how good the individual is. For example, now there is an experiment in Wales. The lady in charge, she's great, so she's going to do a great job. But you might have a Trump instead. And then, you know, so I'm very skeptical about the idea of representation. And I'm skeptical about the ability of picking young people to make sure we care about the future. But I still think we could redesign our institutions to make choices about the future more explicit, have maybe committees, several types of people thinking about the future and so on. So there is stuff we can do, but it's what we are able to do in terms of institutional design, I believe, is limited.
Okay, that's a realistic take on these things. There was a question here. On the gray sweater.
Yeah, thank you very much for your talk. I want to move on. I want to get this latest discussion a bit more on the descriptive side, maybe, because I think for the first time in history, maybe, but correct me if I'm wrong. I'm not a historian. It's no longer the youngest generation, at least in Western countries, in developed countries, that is the biggest share of the electorate. But for the first time, it's elderly that are the biggest electorate, and that's even in considering that people younger than 18, at least in the Netherlands, can vote. How do you think that will impact generational or birth cohort differences?
I think it has a major impact. And it's not clear what policy measures we should take. We could imagine having two constituencies to counterbalance the dominance of certain age groups. But again, if there are no systematic types of view that you can associate with age groups, then of course the significance of this can be challenged. But I mean, on long-termism, I think that the data don't confirm that young people care more about the future than old people. On pensions, I think it's a different story. So policies like pensions, we are in trouble because pensions should have been reformed a few decades ago, and now it's too late. It's very difficult to do with the constituencies we have. So that might call for institutional design. For example, for a policy in which it involves clearly different groups with very different stakes, we could have separate chambers and kind of double majority rule or these kind of things.
So you are sort of presupposing an indirect reciprocity view here, right? When you're saying that we are in trouble with the pension system, that there is an imbalance between these larger and smaller cohorts. So there is actually a normative view here.
But not about reciprocity, but I believe that if there are differences in magnitude between the cohorts, you need to adjust the contribution rates, I believe. And
you could say sufficitarian thresholds.
Yeah, but our pensions do more than sufficiency.
That's what I'm saying. You're making a normative judgment about how the pension system would be just between the generations, right? Which we need if you want to say the current situation is not just.
So I believe that if your pension system goes beyond just sufficiency, and even if it does, I believe that the evolution of the respective size of the birth cohorts require an adjustment of the contribution rates and the benefits on the other side. So I think that's necessary, and you can have automatic ways of doing it, but of course you need to argue for what you want to put in terms of content in that. But what the question you're raising is the political economy of this. So we might have a substantive criterion about, okay, this is a fair way of addressing pensions policy, but how do we make sure that societies actually adopt this? Right? And the point you're making is that if we have a large imbalance, like imagine we had 80% of women and 20% of men in society, and we kept democracy as it is. Maybe there would be calls for changing, redesigning our institutions, because any policies that has a gender impact would be completely ruled by women, right? As it was before by men when women had no power in parliament, right? I don't think there's a big difference between having only men in parliament and the reverse situation in which you would have 80% of women and 20% of men. It's the same kind of problem.
You want to have a short follow-up? Then you need to get the mic once more.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, I think that's a bit of an unfair comparison, because that's not really what my question is about. I was not asking about what if one of the other groups is bigger. I was asking how do the things change now that for the first time in history we have a different group that is the biggest, that is the biggest group. And
so it was an empirical question.
In a sense, maybe, yeah. And how does it relate to this question, is my generation better off than yours?
So I guess the typical answer would be if the group of older people is becoming larger, then they can secure benefits, and that can have an impact on how overall the different cohorts are going to do. I guess that's the answer. If you believe that, yeah.
So then you're asking the question of tonight, you're answering the question of tonight with, for the first time in history, yes, that is now the case.
But I'm not saying it's the first case in history. I'm saying that the...
Okay, then without first case in history, then my generation, the younger generation, can now answer the question, is my generation better off than yours, with no, my generation is worse off than
because you have less power?
Before.
Because you have less power? Oh.
No, not necessarily. I was asking because we have less. I was asking if now there is a different electorate, and your answer was then yes, you're worse off.
Well, it was focused on the pension system, and that's of course one dimension of these things, and that's where the big political clash often happens. There would still be a question: could the younger generations be better off in other respects? And how do you relate this to each other?
But you lost relative power as a generation.
In the political demography.
That was my question to you, yeah.
Yeah, I think so. It's one of the dimensions that affects how well you're doing, yes. I would say yes.
And we can't just install some ombudsperson because of the difficulties of making sure that that person would do a good job. So some people have made this radical proposal that old people above a certain age threshold should actually not vote anymore. Either lose the right, or they should abstain from voting for moral reasons, or they should ask their grandchildren how to vote. What do you think about that kind of idea?
Yeah, I mean, you can also modify the weight of... So I have a paper on that too. I've written a paper on that too. I'm not sure, but I think that in the case of pensions, we have a problem, definitely. Whether the answer is to give less weight to old people individually, or how we could do it exactly, I don't have clear ideas about that.
It's probably also very different from country to country because the details matter once you start looking into these things. I haven't seen any more hands. We could take, oh, there we are. Maybe the sir at the back, so that we have also a bit of age
Hello,
diversity.
good evening. My name is Alexander. I'm 47.2 years old. And I have a question for anybody in the room who is younger than I am. Is there a general sense that you have it better or worse than the old geezers in the room?
But they don't know you, no?
No, not so much me, but in general.
Well, Nina tried to get a sense of this at the beginning, so maybe we can have a show of hands again. So people who are younger than...
Yeah.
Who
anyone
of the
who should
people
like
who are
share the-
younger than 47.2 thinks that they have it better than the generation of those who are of this age group? You want to speak for your generation?
It was also kind of my question. Earlier you were talking about how relative happiness is as a subjective experience measure, but I was thinking like the degree to which we can now self-actualize and have the freedom, because we have so many of the basic needs fulfilled, we have so much time to develop ourselves, to engage in self-actualization. To what degree is self-actualization actually useful for comparing those cohorts or generations, in the sense that I think we're now better off regarding that, even though other subjective experience measures may not be as useful.
So your answer would be your generation is better off than that of the gentleman, because there are more opportunities for how to live our lives?
But there are many, oh, sorry.
Maybe we take one more voice and then...
Perhaps a very real example is suicide rates. So we've seen that shift across generations. So usually it's late adults, late 20s adults, males, was usually high, but we saw during COVID it shift. So it's slightly younger now. So I'm just wondering, that's quite a good indication of the fact that younger generations are getting unhappier. I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe on suicide rate. So I was reading earlier today, this passage on suicide rate by Duffy. And he says that one of the problems of suicide rate is that suicide is a practice that is quite marginal. And so the impact on the generation as a whole is not so easy to, it's not sure we can use it as an indicator of how a generation as a whole is faring. But he's showing that the trends are not, there are no significant trends in the case of suicide, so according to his data. And so to answer your question, there are definitely ways in which your generation is doing better. So including in terms of health, so here in the book he gives the example of smoking and alcohol. It's going down completely from generation to generation. Drugs, it's less clear, but certainly alcohol and
that count is doing better, just to...
No, so alcohol and smoking are going down, right? Drugs is not sure, obesity is not going better. But for example, people like Hans Rosling, the guy, I don't know if you know this guy, he died now, but there's a site called Gapminder, and they are very concerned about facts, and it's a very well done site. And so Hans Rosling was a great optimist. He kept insisting on the reduction of poverty rates. He says, but poverty is going down. I mean, this is one of the most important things. So we are doing better and better. So if you look at that, you might say, in that respect, we are definitely doing better. But in terms of inequalities are increasing. Right? So if inequalities are increasing and they have a major impact on how a generation is doing, there are still many other respects in which there is room for concern.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. I want to conclude with one more quote from Billy Joel, because it relates directly to what we're doing here, or trying to do. So he says, the graduations hang on the wall, but they never really helped us at all. No, they never taught us what was real iron and coke, chromium, steel. Now, and of course, the general thing here is the older generation teaches the young generation, but how can we actually know that we teach the young generation something that's going to be useful for them? And to be honest, I worry about this. I mean, what kind of future are my students going to live in, and what am I giving them that's going to prepare them for that future? How do you think about that? Are we doing a good job? Or maybe, you know, do we need other approaches? Should we learn from the younger ones more, maybe?
Well, we do, no?
Hopefully, well, I try, but
I
as
mean,
universities?
like teaching is an interaction with students, so of course you learn from your students as much as they learn from you. And I guess it's a mix of the own view we have about our own view that how we anticipate the future to be ourselves, and how we anticipate it to be in dialogue with the students, or how they see it and so on. And I guess when we teach, to some extent, we try to anticipate that to make our, I mean, if we teach climate justice, for example, it's because we think that is going to remain an important problem in the future. So maybe there are other issues we don't teach about. And but whether we are doing a good job, that's not for me to judge.
Right?
Yes.
Okay. Axel, thank you so
Thank
much
you.
for being here with us tonight. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I hand over to Nina for the concluding words.
Yeah, I just wanted to finish up and thank you again. I have as a token of appreciation, I have a gift for you. A book by Barbara Stock. She's a graphic, what is she? Yes, she's a comic maker, and this is a book about one of the first female philosophers, Hipparchia, the philosopher, the dog in a wedding. It's a very nice book. There you go. And thank you all for coming. We have a very full program for November. Please check out our program. There are probably leaflets on the table outside. Next week we have a science cafe about Halloween, about why we like horror so much and why we celebrate Halloween anyway. What is it about? Thanks all for coming, and hopefully we'll see you somewhere in the coming events. Have a good evening.